Good evening, everyone. Tonight I want to share with you one of the many stories my grandfather used to tell us. Some gave us nightmares, others were beyond reality, but he always had stories to share. This is my favorite, and it is about the time he worked for a few years in a women's prison. That was many years ago. My grandfather, Don Pedro Cervantes, worked in a women's prison in his hometown. This place at times was overcrowded, especially when they brought in women for various crimes. Some crimes were very serious, like taking the lives of their husbands or partners. Others were involved in child theft, and these children would disappear without a trace. Others were picked up from the streets or corners for offering their services. At that time, my grandfather was only 24 years old, and one didn't need a degree to be an officer in a penitentiary. Jobs were obtained even without knowing how to read or write, with just a few years of elementary education from the surrounding towns. When the crime was significant, and they were to be sent to the Islas Marias, just knowing they would be taken there made many try to escape, albeit unsuccessfully. Others, in their desperation, took their own lives by night in their cells. It was hard to control so many women, as that cursed confinement drove them mad. My grandfather said that there were both bad and good women. Some were innocent but unfortunately ended their days behind bars because the lawyers appointed to defend them would either extort money from them or bury them deeper, leading to their being declared guilty of crimes they never committed. The penitentiary was 2 stories high but had 3 pavilions where the inmates were distributed according to the danger they posed. There was one pavilion that even the bravest of them would come out as tame as a lamb after just one night. This place was called the dungeons. Everyone feared one cell in particular, cell number 9. One of the guards told my grandfather that about 2 years before he started working there, they had brought in 15 women, some for minor offenses and others destined for the Islas Marias. Among those who would go to the island was a woman accused of being a witch. Some claimed she was innocent, others said she had made a pact with the devil himself, which is why she remained young and beautiful. She wasn't accused of engaging in witchcraft per se. The report on her stated that children's clothing, belonging to a child who had disappeared and was never found, was found in her house. The clothing had cuts and blood on it, which condemned the woman. However, those who defended her claimed that someone else had taken the child's life and that they were pinning the blame on an innocent woman. Everyone in the prison feared her, from the inmates to the guards, and when she walked out into the yard, the other women would step aside, whether or not they believed she was a witch, out of fear. Only one woman during the witch's time in that prison showed neither fear nor respect for her: the Mayora, the boss of the guards in that women's prison. The Mayora noticed how the others feared the witch more than her, which she did not like, and took it upon herself to make the witch's life difficult, often throwing her into dungeon number 9 for nearly a month at a time. But the witch had her herbs and potions, supplied by someone inside the prison, and gradually built up a clientele within the walls using her witchcraft. Women who had lost all hope were suddenly declared innocent, and in gratitude, they visited her, bringing whatever the witch requested in payment. According to the guard, the witch did something because, on the day they were to be taken to the Islas Marias, the witch's name was not called, nor was she listed to be transferred along with the other inmates. From then on, the witch's fame within the prison grew, and this did not sit well with the Mayora, who was known to instill fear within the women's prison. The witch realized that many women suffered because of the abuses by some guards, compelled by the Mayora. On many occasions, the witch ended up in the dungeon simply because the Mayora willed it. The witch spent weeks at a time in that damp and cold place. It was during these times when she was being punished that the women began to call her the Witch of the Dungeon. The Mayora would often come down with a paper bag containing food, eating it in front of the witch, leaving her without food for days and enjoying every moment of the poor woman's weakness. When the witch was asleep, she would douse her with cold water in the middle of the night, leading the witch to fall gravely ill. But perhaps what they were doing to her, if she had ever been a good woman, was changing her completely, because the last time she was punished in the dungeons, her appearance had changed significantly. It was only a matter of time before the goodwill of that woman shattered, giving way to malevolence. The witch became very vindictive, and those who interfered with her or tried to harm her did not enjoy their triumph for long, as strange things began happening in that part of the cells. Day by day, the witch gained more and more strength, to the point where she claimed she could enter and exit the prison as she pleased. Often strange objects were found in her cell, from human skulls and bones to various herbs she used for her witchcraft, both inside and outside the prison. The witch had clients, and her daily visitors always brought her money. In exchange for a pack of cigarettes, they would defend the witch from anyone who tried to harm her. As time passed, the days grew gray and rainy, signaling the approach of winter. One afternoon, the witch summoned another guard, the one who told me this story, making her very nervous. The witch needed her to do a favor without the Mayora finding out. She asked for a blessed scapular, but when the guard questioned why she needed it, given that everyone knew she worshipped the devil, the witch replied that she needed it urgently, and that if the guard did not provide it, she would ask someone else, and the guard would not be responsible for what might happen. With those words, the guard could not refuse the witch's request, and obtained what she had asked for, although somehow the Mayora found out. Before the guard left, the witch gave her some herbs, instructing her to take them upon reaching home, as they would keep her away from the prison for a while, since something was about to happen, and it was better to stay away. The guard was absent for nearly a week, and perhaps thanks to the witch's help, she saved her life. Nevertheless, the Mayora had her thrown back into dungeon number 9. In the cell next to the witch, they locked up Juana, a very troublesome inmate who also showed no fear or respect for the Mayora. She was there for about 3 days, but before her punishment was over, the witch warned some inmates that it was better for them to stay underground because, in a few days, fire would fall from above, and if they went out, they would either die with the others or be left deformed by the fire. This terrified the women, who did everything possible not to leave the dungeons, even after their punishment was over. They hit the guards and were thrown back into the dungeons, but none mentioned that the witch had told them so. What the witch had predicted happened. The cries for help from the inmates trying to escape the disaster reached even there. That day, a riot broke out in the prison, resulting in many inmate and guard fatalities, including the Mayora. It was said that during the riots, the Mayora made the mistake of crossing the gate that separated the inmates from the exit to one of the pavilions leading to the main yard, where many thought they could escape. The resentment and anger in many of them became evident, and upon seeing the Mayora defenseless, they locked her in one of the cells and set it on fire with blankets and other items, starting a fire as the witch had said. Many died. Others were left deformed by burns, but those in the dungeons were spared. The witch with her herbs healed several, although the scars remained visible. They thanked her with coins or whatever little they had left, increasing the witch's fame just as it had been when she first arrived. The other inmates stepped aside to let her pass, earning her respect not only from the inmates but also from the guards. They asked her for favors, and she fulfilled them. If there was an inspection, everyone covered for the witch. There was no one who dared to mess with her. Over time, a new head guard was appointed, and even she feared the witch, who never again entered any of the dungeons during her years of imprisonment. The witch performed many works, many spells, and those who dared to ask whom she worked for, she would smile and say, "For him himself." Before my grandfather started working in that women's prison, the witch was released and swore woe to anyone who tried to imprison her again. Some claimed she returned to her village and avenged those who had wronged her. After that, no one knew more about the witch of the dungeons. When someone was punished and locked in dungeon number 9, it was claimed that they encountered that woman. Some were heard conversing with her. Others came out dead, their faces reflecting the fear of what they had seen before dying. Sometimes groans and whispers were heard, and on nights when the sky turned black, signaling the approach of rain, it seemed as if the place repeated the night of the fire. One could swear the smell of smoke was in the air, but there was no trace that something like that would happen again. On several occasions, women being punished begged not to be placed in that cell, claiming that the witch appeared with them, even though the cell was empty. My grandfather heard a woman conversing with someone on several occasions, and upon opening the door, the dungeon was completely empty. Although drawings on the wall, which he did not understand until many years later, were told to be invocations and petitions for her not to be harmed. Perhaps in that disaster where many died, the witch of the dungeons made a pact with her lord, offering those souls in exchange for her freedom. Soon, no one wanted to be in the cell where she had been imprisoned, claiming that he was also with them. My grandfather never knew the name of that witch. As I mentioned a moment ago, her name never appeared in any prison record. It was as if that woman had never existed. My grandfather always said it was impossible to forget those days he worked in the women's prison. Although today that place no longer exists as a penitentiary and has been repurposed and is open to the public, just thinking about the anguish, terror, and desperation that those women experienced night and day within those high walls, which merely jumping over would grant them freedom, a freedom their misdeeds had condemned them to spend the rest of their lives in a women's prison. Others ended their days within the dungeons. When my grandfather stopped working in that place, one of his colleagues told him that the woman was in the village. More than 20 years had passed since what happened in that penitentiary, and when my grandfather went to look for her, he met a very young and beautiful woman. Seeing her, he believed she was not the same woman his colleagues had talked so much about. She told my grandfather that she was the one he was looking for, but she would not tell him anything about her days in that place, as that was behind her, and there was no way she wanted to relive it. So my grandfather confirmed that his former colleagues in the prison assured him she could help him with a problem he had, but he also let her know that he did not believe in witchcraft, and that he had been forced to turn to her. Without my grandfather uttering more words, the witch gave him some bundles of herbs and told him to prepare them for his son to take, assuring him that it would help him and his son in a month. He left the place with little faith, and upon arriving home, he handed the herbs to my grandmother to prepare them. A month later, as the witch had said, my grandparents arrived in the village where the witch lived, and my father walked into the house of that woman without any trace of the polio that had kept him bedridden. My grandparents maintained a friendship with her until the day she died, and although my grandfather insists that she was innocent, many did not believe it, and her witchcraft saved her from not having died within that dark and cold dungeon. Good evening, community. My name is Ernesto, and I want to share with you the experience that I, my siblings, and my friends in the neighborhood where we lived had as children. At that time, we were haunted by very evil women who turned out to be witches responsible for several horrible events that occurred there. To give you a bit of context, the neighborhood where I lived was lower middle class. My family didn't have much money, but we lived comfortably in a reasonably spacious single-story house. It was there that I met who are now my best friends. To this day, we still get together, reminiscing about those old times when we played in the street and went to the park to play soccer, among other adventures. We had a lot of fun, especially since there wasn't as much technology back then, and what we did for fun was precisely going out to play in the streets. However, not everything was rosy, as I mentioned. These witches terrorized us, leaving us with traumatic experiences. My friends from the block and I were between 7 and 12 years old. My 2 younger brothers were 4 and 6, too young, so they weren't allowed to go out and play with me yet. I was 11, and my best friend Gerardo was 12, the oldest in our little group. My mother always warned us not to go to the end of the street, where the houses ended and a large wooded area began. She said it was very dangerous, but I never knew why until much later. There were rumors of an abandoned house in those woods, and that recently, women of peculiar appearance had moved in there without anyone's permission. Nobody dared to confront them due to their appearance, and everyone said they were witches. Nobody knew who they were or where they came from. One night, I remember, Gerardo and I were walking back from the park after a long afternoon of playing soccer with our friends. We were the last to leave because we stayed chatting on a bench. As we walked to our houses, we had to pass by that block, not going into it, but we could see it as we crossed the street. Suddenly, we heard an eerily sharp laughter coming from the rooftop of one of the houses. Gerardo and I immediately looked up, and there we saw something that made us run away at full speed. On the roof of a house on that block was a lady with long gray hair crawling on the roof, following us as we walked with the most malevolent gaze I've ever seen in my life and a grin showing her teeth, accompanied by those horrifying chuckles that made every hair on our bodies stand on end. The woman crawled impressively fast, and of course, upon seeing that, my friend and I ran to our homes. Gerardo lived 4 houses before mine, so he went into his house and told me not to stop running until I got to mine. That witch kept following me, crawling from roof to roof, and was so fast that she arrived at the same time as I did. When I finally got to my house before going in, I couldn't help but look up at the roof right away because I knew she was there, watching me. I continued to have that terrifying image of that woman in my mind, and couldn't erase from my mind how she had followed me home as if she were truly an animal. I didn't mention anything to my mother because I knew she wouldn't believe me, or she might not let me go out to play with my friends anymore. Despite that terrifying moment, I still wanted to go out with them, as it was my only distraction back then. That night I could hardly sleep and had many nightmares about that woman, filled with doubts about why she had followed me and what she wanted to do to me. The next day, after returning from school and like every afternoon, I went out with my friends to play in the park. That day, Gerardo and I told the others what had happened the previous night, and several of them said they had also seen old ladies spying on them from light poles before. One of them recounted that a few days ago, his mother had sent him to the store at night, and one of these ladies was behind a van, yelling at him to come over because she wanted to give him something. However, this lady never showed herself and never came out from behind the van. He said he knew it was an old lady because he could hear it in her voice and could see her gray hair peeking out from behind that van. He was very scared and ran back to his house, but also didn't tell his parents anything. We all talked about these experiences, and again, it got dark. We were sitting in the middle of the park's field when suddenly we heard and could see a very large animal flying and going into the branches of a huge tree next to the field. I couldn't see it because I was on the other side of the tree, but I heard the branches hitting and even saw some falling. I saw the astonishment on my friends' faces who had seen that thing entering the tree, and we all wanted to know what it was. It couldn't just be a simple bird. They said that thing looked about the size of one of us. We got up and slowly started to approach that tree, but it was too dark. We couldn't see anything among so many branches, but then that same chilling laughter we had heard the night before came from that tree. I remember yelling at everyone to run, and we all did as fast as we could, each in the direction of our homes. Gerardo and I were running to ours when, crossing that street, we saw that gigantic animal flying toward that wooded area, entering that abandoned house. We stopped and watched because it was something that shocked us both, and after that, we concluded that those were the witches, the same ones who spied on and followed us and the other children in the neighborhood. When I got home, my mother called me to her room. She wanted to talk to me. I thought she was going to scold me for coming home late again, but this time she looked worried. She closed the door so my brothers wouldn't hear and told me to sit down. Then she began to say that she didn't want me to go out in the afternoons anymore because very bad things were happening in the area. She told me that her friend Rosa, who was our neighbor and lived on that block where the wooded area was at the end of the street, had told her that day to be very careful with my brothers and me. There were women doing very bad things in that abandoned house, as many neighbors from that block had complained about the bad, putrid smells at night. When they went out to investigate what it was, they saw that a lot of smoke was coming out of that house and that the smells were coming from there too. She also told her that for 3 days, they had heard nothing from Mr. Santiago, an elderly man who lived alone on that block and was known for being grumpy. He always scolded us when we played on that block because we made a lot of noise. But one night, some neighbors saw him very angry, leaving his house. When asked where he was going, he said he was going to complain to the people who were doing filthy things in that abandoned house, to get out of there, or he would call the police because the smell was unbearably. Mr. Santiago was the only one who dared to see what was happening, but he never returned. My mother didn't understand how it was that nobody had called the police yet, but Rosa told her that everyone was afraid because they knew those women were very bad witches and didn't want to get involved with them, as many strange things had been seen happening in that place. I was scared for several days and didn't go out. My friends came to my house to ask me to go out and play with them, but my mother made up any excuse to keep me locked up until one day, tired of being alone within 4 walls and wanting to go out and play with my friends from the neighborhood. Honestly, there wasn't much to do at home other than watch TV, but I wanted to expend my energy running and playing soccer. Simply, I couldn't stand being locked up all day. So one afternoon I asked my mother for permission to go out, promising her that I would return home before it got dark. With much anguish, she gave me permission, knowing I hadn't gone out in days but reiterating to me to be very careful. I left my house and went to look for my friend Gerardo. I knocked on the door of his house and his mother came out, who told me somewhat rudely that Gerardo was not going to go out to play and that I should not come looking for him anymore. I was somewhat confused by the way she spoke to me because she always treated me very well, being a friend of her son and because we were neighbors and had known each other for a long time. I knew that something very bad had happened. I walked to the park where I met several of my friends from the neighborhood who told me what had happened to Gerardo. A few days ago, he had told them the day before they came to look for him at his house before his mother kicked them out. He told them that he was walking back alone to his house after playing all day in the park because I was no longer accompanying him. Suddenly, he felt someone following him. Several ladies of disturbing appearance were all over the street among the cars and light poles. He was walking in the middle of the street, and when he realized that, he began to run with all his might. But one of them caught up to him and tried to grab his shoulder, wounding him with her very long nails, tearing that part of his shirt and leaving him with deep scratches. He began to scream desperately for help when the storekeepers heard him and came out to help him. He was lying in the street, crying and bleeding, but those women were no longer there. They had disappeared as if by magic when these men came out of the store. They themselves accompanied him to his house, and his mother was horrified. Gerardo showed them a scratch on his back, right behind his shoulder, and it looked like a scratch from an animal, given how large and deep it was. He no longer wanted to go out, and neither would his mother let him go out for at least a good while. I was very sad, and at the same time so afraid to hear that. I couldn't believe it. It felt like we were living in a nightmare with those witches in our neighborhood. I was fed up with them, but there was nothing an 11-year-old boy like me could do. I remember that the next day I was at my house getting ready to sleep. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth and putting on my pajamas, when suddenly, I heard my younger brother calling me from the other room where we slept. He, my other brother, and I heard him calling me Nito, as he called me, with his little boy's voice. I yelled at him to wait for me to come out of the bathroom, but he called out to me again insistently. I came out of the bathroom annoyed, telling him to go to sleep, but my whole body tensed up when I saw that my two brothers were sound asleep. I woke up my little brother with much effort because I wanted to ask him if he had called me, but he said no and went back to sleep. Then I turned my head towards the window, and there was one of those witches standing there, looking at me through the window, smiling at me with her yellow teeth, waving at me with her wrinkled hand and long nails. I screamed so loudly that I woke everyone in my house. My little brother got scared and started crying. My parents immediately came to our room, asking what had happened, and I pointed at the window without being able to say a single word. But of course that witch was no longer there. It took me a few minutes to be able to tell them what had happened. My mother believed me and took us all to sleep in her room. My father stayed in the living room because he also wanted to protect us. Things were getting out of control. Neither my mother nor I slept all night. I was very scared, and my mother was afraid that those women would do something to me or my brothers. So, the next day, I heard her talking about the possibility of moving from the neighborhood, which made me very sad because all my friends were there. Months passed and many people had moved from the neighborhood, especially those who lived on that block next to the wooded area, because they could no longer stand everything that was happening. Those women did not let them live in peace. They performed rituals in the place, emitting nauseating smells throughout the block. The number of missing people also increased. Many pets disappeared out of nowhere in their homes, like dogs or cats. Children no longer went out to play and everything was getting worse. If you wonder why nobody called the police, the answer is that they did, repeatedly. But every time the police arrived at the place, that house was completely empty, abandoned, with nothing inside, as if nobody had lived there in years. The first time it was reported to the police, several patrol cars arrived and everyone went with their weapons in hand to that house, but they found nothing. It was as if those witches knew they were coming for them. I don't know what pacts they made and with whom, but they were extremely powerful. I can assure you of that. And they always knew who had reported them to the authorities because the next day after the police raided their house, something would happen to the house of the person who had called them, such as a fire for no reason while they were not there, or plagues of spiders or cockroaches among many other things. That's why nobody wanted to call the police anymore, adding that they no longer believed them because whenever they went, there was absolutely nobody in the place. That period of my childhood was like living in a nightmare, but the worst was about to happen. One night while we were sleeping, some noises suddenly woke up me and my middle brother. Footsteps could be heard on the roof and scratches. My brother ran to my bed to hug me. He knew it was those witches trying to scare us. I told him not to make any noise. I closed the curtains and we stayed silent because I didn't want them to know we were awake. I knew they liked us to be afraid, as if they fed on that. But if fear didn't invade our bodies and we didn't make a single noise, that night we were alone with my mother because my father had gone out of town for a few days for work. So, with just my 11 years, I was the man of the house at that moment. We were in bed without making a sound. I felt my brother's body trembling. I hugged him and tried to calm him down when suddenly those noises stopped. Nothing was heard for a few minutes. We believed that everything had passed and that those witches had left. And suddenly, someone knocked on the door, but it was my mother, and she asked if she could come in. I told her yes and to come in. When she opened the door, my brother ran out of bed to hug and cry with her, but my mother had a very, very strange expression that gave me chills. She hugged him and caressed his back while having a smile and staring at me fixedly. She wasn't acting worried as she always did when she saw us scared and crying. She didn't even ask what was wrong with my brother. She just caressed him while my brother cried to her, telling her that those witches had gone to the house and that he was very scared. I knew something wasn't right. It was as if every cell in my body was warning me to take my brother out of her arms. I told my brother to come to bed, that he could sleep with me if he wanted, but he told me no, that he wanted to go to sleep with my mother. Meanwhile, she continued smiling at me and caressing his back. My brother asked her if he could go to sleep with her in her room, and she slowly turned to look at him with that macabre smile, nodding her head up and down, telling him yes but without speaking. I knew I had to do something to prevent it, but I didn't know what to do. And then my youngest brother woke up and, upon seeing my mother, started crying out of nowhere. He cried non-stop as if he didn't recognize her, and there, I knew that person was not my mother. I jumped out of bed in a matter of seconds, snatched my brother from her arms, and with all my strength, pushed her and locked the door. Then, that witch began to scratch the door and make horrible sounds as if it were an animal. My two brothers were crying non-stop. I was behind the door, holding it because the force in the knocks was so strong that I felt it was going to knock it down. Then it occurred to me to start praying the Our Father and put my middle brother to help me because the youngest could barely speak well and continued crying uncontrollably. My brother and I began to say the prayer out loud and repeat it many times until that thing stopped knocking and scratching the door, and suddenly nothing was heard anymore. We stayed hugging each other, the three of us awake until dawn. We didn't know what had happened to my real mother, why she hadn't heard what was happening, or if there had been so much noise. I wondered if maybe those witches had done something to her. At the first light of day, I decided to open the door, which on the outside had scratches as if a very large animal had made them. I walked to my mother's door, and there she was, sleeping deeply. I moved her, but she didn't react. I yelled at her many times and she couldn't wake up. I spent a lot of time there crying, until she finally opened her eyes. I don't know what those witches had done to her, but they put her to sleep deeply, and she hadn't noticed anything that had happened. That was the last straw for my parents. After seeing how the door was, they knew it had been real. Within a week, we were already moving from the house, and during that entire week, we went to stay at my uncle's house while the move was finished. I can't tell you what happened to those witches because after moving, we never returned to that place again. My mother lost communication with her neighbors who were her friends. It was as if she wanted to erase everything and start anew. She didn't want a single memory of that place. Years later, when I grew up, I got back in touch with my friends from the neighborhood through social networks. We got back in contact while I was in college, and from what they told me, after we left, there were still disappearances of people, and they no longer left their houses for anything. Until finally, the neighbors from the entire neighborhood agreed, and together with a priest, they went to bless that house, and then they burned it. After that, everything returned to normal, although of course it never returned to being the same peaceful neighborhood. People were left with the aftermath of what had happened, and many took a long time to go out at night again, and the park was almost empty every night. We lived to tell this terrible anecdote that somewhat truncated our childhoods and is now just this terrifying experience worthy of being told. After that, to this day, nothing is known about those witches, whether they are alive or dead, or if they are still there with their pure evil, kidnapping and killing people. Thank you for listening to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. See you in the next video. Good night.